Next, I wanted to talk about the Russian response to the terrorist attacks. The terrorists have been caught. They were in court. They were in court for obviously the terrorist attacks, but they still had the plastic bags around their neck from the torturing sessions. Their faces were swollen. One guy was unconscious. He had to be wheeled in a wheelchair. He wasn't even awake. So the trials were set for May. These were just kind of setting the trial dates and such. They'll be kept in detention until May. There's also some possible massive bombing runs to take place in Ukraine. Ukraine was expecting this over the weekend. It didn't really take place. There were about 14 Russian bombers in the air. I believe it was Saturday night or Friday night. I can't remember. And Ukraine's whole country was on alert. Nothing really happened. Those bombers had nuclear capabilities, by the way. Nothing really happened of that yet. There were some bombings from Crimea that took place in response. But there hasn't really been a widespread, massive bombing run like there was expected. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it does happen eventually. There will be a big response eventually. It may not be as dramatic as tactical nukes, and I hope it doesn't, but I do think there will be a widespread, big throttle, probably one like we haven't seen yet in this war, in response to these terrorist attacks. Putin addressed the nation today, the nation of Russia, obviously blaming Ukraine. He also mentioned that the U.S. is trying to convince everyone, including other nations, that Ukraine had nothing to do with it. And then asked a very practical and valid question, I would think. Then why were the terrorists caught fleeing to Ukraine? And why was there a set window set for them to cross the border? I think that's a very valid question. If Ukraine had nothing to do with it, why are these supposed Islamic terrorists fleeing to Ukraine of all countries? You would think they would flee elsewhere, back to the Middle East, towards that direction, not directly to Ukraine. So that's a key illustration of Ukraine likely had something to do with it. It's really troubling to see. I mean, I talked about this last episode. I went to in depth about the terrorist attacks last episode. The U.S.'s response, like I mentioned, is pretty fishy, especially with their advance notice of potential terrorist attacks, and then mentioned in the notice the exact places that the terrorist attack did take place, like theaters and concerts and malls. I would keep an eye on Russia's rhetoric going forward. Obviously, anybody could have predicted that Putin was going to blame Ukraine, especially when the terrorists were caught fleeing back to Ukraine. I mean, I think that's very valid. I mean, if the terrorists who commit attacks are fleeing back to a country that you're at war with, what would any logical person conclude from that? I mean, there's no conclusive evidence yet, at least public. Russia and Putin may have evidence that they're not sharing, that Ukraine and the U.S. directly ordered the attacks. He mentioned in the speech that he is certain that Ukraine had something to do with this, but he said that he wants to know who ordered the attacks. And that's really concerning, because you can allude from that he's alluding to the U.S. and the U.S. having involvement in this, that the U.S. ordered Ukraine to have these attacks take place. I mean, even if he's not alluding to the U.S., he's alluding to Ukraine possibly ordering the attacks, and we've been supporting Ukraine, so we will kind of be meddled into that, and NATO. So if the rhetoric continues to putting the blame on the U.S. and NATO on top of Ukraine, things could get dicey. Things could get a little suspect. I do not think Russia will initiate a widespread conflict with NATO and the United States with nuclear war or such, but we'll be pushed further toward that edge, and things will get more. That possibility and the likelihood of that happening will only rise, because Russia will respond militarily, obviously, and when bombs start dropping and stuff starts happening, there's more of a chance for crap to happen that could escalate things even more into a wider conflict. Somebody gets killed, like a Zelensky or such, and that could probe NATO or the U.S. to feel inclined to get directly involved. Like I said, I do not think Russia will initially strike NATO or strike the U.S., but obviously a military action, one that hasn't even been reached yet in the war in terms of widespread bombings that were mentioned to possibly take place. I think it eventually will take place. I think they need time to strategically, figure that all out. But if that happens, even if it's not a direct strike at the U.S. or NATO, the likelihood of a wider conflict only rises, and rises quite dramatically, especially if you have a bombings run or a military action that hasn't been reached yet in the war. The trending is going upwards in terms of likelihood for a bigger conflict to take place. And, it's just really worrying when Putin mentions the U.S. and possibly ordering or having something to do with terrorist attacks like this, which have taken the lives of 140 people in Russia. It's very troubling because the Russian rhetoric is leaning towards the route of putting the blame on the U.S. on top of Ukraine in this. So it's worrying, and it's something to watch. It will be interesting to see if these terrorists even make it alive to the trials. I mean, there's videos of them during interrogation cutting off their ears, feeding it to them, other torturous methods that were horrible, but these people deserve it. I mean, these animals that go in and kill 140 Russians, innocent civilians like that. It was interesting. France also raised its terrorist attack potential or warning. It was I can't remember the name of the exact level, but it was the highest level possible. So you have to wonder what's that all about. I don't think they were expecting a terrorist attack from Russia, but it's I guess had something to do with the Islamic terrorists that committed those acts in Russia. So maybe not Russia, but I don't know. There wasn't much beyond the reasoning of why, but it was interesting to see that France was expecting a terrorist attack, like at the highest level of threat. So that's something to watch. Will there be widespread terrorist attacks throughout Europe? Was Moscow just the first thing? If Ukraine directly wasn't involved and these were just Islamic terrorists, if this was just ISIS, and France is having its terrorist attack threat level at the highest point, at the highest level, was Moscow just kind of the first European city, and there's about to be a widespread terrorist attacks across Europe? I'm not sure how likely that is, but it's something to keep an eye on. So, like I said, something like this could be... Putin has an eventual breaking point. His, I believe, is a lot harder to reach than others, but that breaking point exists. Every leader has a breaking point where enough's enough, right? Could this be that breaking point if he eventually finds out that the United States has something to do with it, or Ukraine, and kind of meddles the U.S. with Ukraine and that, and they respond to us and NATO on top of Ukraine? Will this attack or something like this cause him to break? I mean, he's held restraint throughout the whole Ukrainian war with NATO's involvement and the U.S.'s involvement. I mean, it's blatant. It's not just we're supporting them, we're keeping the war alive. Ukraine could not keep fighting this war. I mean, the war would have been over a long time ago. They're using primarily our weapons. They haven't even received the F-16s yet that we promised them. So, I mean, we're keeping the war alive. So that is direct involvement. Putin has held restraint to not launch into a wider conflict and is still open to peace negotiations. But when stuff like this happens, especially if the United States and NATO was involved in this, that doesn't help the cause of reaching any peace negotiations. This may be something that causes Putin to say enough's enough, offers are off the table, this is war. And that, I don't have to tell you, that is the start of a World War III, essentially. So where is that breaking point for Putin? When is enough enough? When has he seen enough to where he launches it to a wider conflict? I think, like I said, that breaking point is going to be very difficult to reach for Putin, who's held great restraint in all of this. But you have to wonder, I mean, he's human. He has a breaking point. When you have 140 of his own citizens dying from terrorist attacks, and somebody who loves his own citizens like Putin does, like I said in the last episode, that's the whole reason he launched the Ukrainian war, is he felt like his own citizens who held Russian values, Russian culture, spoke Russian, were in Ukraine, and he was claiming back his own people in his own eyes. When somebody loves his own people that much, and something like this happens that kills 140 innocent civilians, is something like that the breaking point where he's had enough? God hope that he does hold restraint, because if he doesn't and launches a wider conflict, things will get very, very dangerous, and that is a world war situation. So, very dangerous situation going on. I mean, there has been one ever since the war started, but when things like this happen, it only raises the likelihood of a wider conflict taking place, and the world is on tipping point. One little match to start it all, and everybody's in a war. Everybody's involved in this. So let's just pray that Putin continues to hold restraint,